I have the advantage of coming and talking to you from the vantage point of running an organization that is focused on turning stem cells into medicines. And in that capacity, I get to see not only what is being done to navigate the pathway through preclinical development, clinical development, and ultimately regulatory approval, but I also get to see what my scientists are thinking up and what they are doing by deconstructing cells, deconstructing materials, and how these things might ultimately become products we can use to treat disease. So I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a background on where I think we are and where I think we're going with this technology. To put this all in context, I wanted to give you a little story about the origins of this because I think it's relevant. Many years ago, 20 years ago, I was taking care of traumatic brain injury patients at a major New York hospital. And in that capacity, I dealt with the tragedy of these disorders and was always frustrated by the fact that we got really good at keeping people alive, but we had really very little to offer them in terms of reversing the horrible defects that occur after those insults. I remember one situation in particular. A young, beautiful young woman was in a terrible car accident, suffered a very severe brain injury, and I was taking care of her, and I was dealing with her family on a daily basis, and her wonderful fiance, and was always being asked, well, what will she be like? What will she be like? Will she ever be back to normal? Can you fix that part of the brain, turn back on those things so that she can be a mother to her children, et cetera, et cetera? That was one of the most heart-wrenching experiences I had to deal with. And I remember after one discussion, I was paged and had to run down to the obstetrics area to see my oldest daughter's ultrasonic debut. And as I walked into the ultrasound suite, and I got a chance to see on the screen there my unborn child in development, it struck me for the first time that although my daughter was a peanut-sized embryo, the placenta was this big organ that was already developed and was dramatically bigger than the embryo. And I remember back to medical school when we were taught that the placenta was sort of a vascular interface between the maternal and the fetal system. It struck me that this organ was going to take care of my unborn child, and it must be doing some pretty remarkable things. And could it, in fact, be the factory, nature's natural stem cell factory? And if so, why is it thrown away? Why is it waste material after a full-term healthy pregnancy? So I got very interested in exploring this and embarked on an effort to learn more about the placenta, more about that period of development, and how that biology could potentially be a tool for us clinically. At the same time, some of my colleagues were doing some really remarkable stuff in the field of fetal surgery. So fetal surgery is when you open up the womb, you remove the unborn baby, you fix a defect, put the baby back into the womb, close it up, and months later, at birth, what is remarkable is that there's no evidence of a surgical repair. It's truly scarless surgery. So what is it about that environment? What is it about that unique biology of the placenta that is so valuable? Could we somehow understand that and turn it into tools that can be used to treat the things that we're fighting every day in the hospital? So I began to think, well, I'm pretty smart. I figured this out. The placenta is the place to be looking. Forget about embryos. Forget about other sources. And one day in the operating room, one of my colleagues grounded me by telling me, you know what? The placenta has been known to be of a remarkable regenerative organ for thousands of years. It turns out the Nazca Indians in Peru 2,000 years ago were creating stone carvings showing the isolation of the placenta, isolation of cells, and then using those in the treatment of diseases. As you can see here in these stone carvings, they're even putting them into the brain. So lucky for me, the United States Patent Office does not consider stone carvings prior art. So in any event, where we are today, so I work in an organization where we're turning stem cells into medicine, and we follow the conventional biologic attributes that are out there. The fact that stem cells can divide and self-renew, they can mature into all the specialized phenotypes of the developed human body. They can remain quiescent in systems and only divide and differentiate upon command. those are the conventional things that allow us to build the tools, and that's what I'm going to simply give you a little bit of background on where we are today. The conventional uses are turn those cells into cytotherapeutics, or like biologic agents, almost like a pharmaceutical factory in a cell can be delivered to treat things like autoimmune disease, help promote and augment the natural regenerative processes, and also the placenta as a source of cells is also a source of other materials, all of which are applicable to the emerging field of tissue engineering. Those are the conventional uses. For us, trying to turn these cells into medicine, the trick in harnessing this power is identifying which cell is a good one, which cell is useful, what are the biological activities of those cells that are important, and then a challenge on the industrial side that's often overlooked in academics is how do you pharmaceuticalize this? Because for cells to have a meaningful role in medicine, someone has to turn them into a format that is readily, easily deployable, and easily adoptable by the clinical community. So pharmaceuticalization was the challenge for us in the last 10 years. And I'm happy to say that using some predicate devices, some of the traditional technologies in the tissue culture environment, we have been able to move this forward so that from a single source, a single placenta, we can actually mass produce hundreds of thousands to millions of doses. That's a critical step because without that, the ability to navigate the regulatory process and clearly the ability to disseminate this type of treatment to the broad population would be impossible. What you see here in my manufacturing facility are cell factories. This is 25-year-old technology. Where we're going from this point forward is to create automated systems, bioreactor systems, all to increase the scale, increase the speed, and lower the cost of doing this. And we're well on our way to doing that. So I mentioned before that the placenta was a source of great building blocks for us. I consider the cells to be a building block. I consider the biologic materials in that organ to be building blocks. The cells as building blocks are incredibly valuable because of their unique biological activities I mentioned before. The placenta is a remarkable source because, first and foremost, it's nature's professional immunomodulator. Okay, remember that a placenta is produced by the developing fetus, an embryo. It is an independent organism to the maternal system, yet it is retained by that mother for 9 months without rejection. That unique immunologic relationship is something that's conserved in the cells and makes it very, very easy to have a one-size-fits-all product. So placental stem cells can be delivered without having to match between recipient and donor. That's crucial. That unique biologic activity, that immunomodulatory behavior, can be applied now to turning off some of the degradative effects of inflammation, chronic inflammation, and the rejection process. So in autoimmune disease, what you're seeing illustrated here is that a suspension of placentally derived stem cells that are immunomodulatory can be used to treat a disorder called Crohn's disease. That's one of the areas we're very actively investigating right now. And what you see here in the center photograph is what a diseased colon looks like in Crohn's. Highly inflamed, obviously very, very diseased. If you use conventional therapy to treat that, such as steroids or other biologic agents, you can kind of quiet that inflammation. But it's not been seen that you can reverse it to a point of actually altering the natural history of the disease. And what you see here is that we can actually return the colon to normal. And in our clinical experience, we're seeing that now in colonoscopy data. Well, all of that taught us that the cells are a lot smarter than we are. We also got interested, and now I'm going to sort of move to what I'm hoping this field is going to move towards. We're getting very, very good at understanding that these cells are smarter than we are, that they can, when administered, they can take up residence in remote locations as well as in areas which have a void or a defect, and they can undergo natural, regenerative, and proliferative processes to repopulate those systems. And what that's taught us is that stem cells, like environments, physical environments, matrices, and they actually seek out and adhere to those physical structures, and they learn lessons from those physical cues, and those cues help them decide how to differentiate, how to mature, how to do the things that are beneficial. So in this illustration, matrix plus cells can be obviously used to create something useful. And in this case, one of the products that we created is a membrane product that can be used to treat defects of the skin. So here's an example of a patient with a very, very nasty second-degree burn. The product in the middle there is basically a native structural matrix derived from the placenta that is then applied to this burn. It encourages the endogenous stem cell population of the skin to populate it and remodel it. And as you can see in the far left, there's a very, very clear difference in the quality of the repair that occurs when encouraged by a matrix versus when it occurs naturally in response to the injury. So that has led us to look at what some of the potential future applications of all this technology might be. So some additional new intellectual property that's been created that we think is exciting is the ability to take any tissue, any organ, any biological structure that has structural elements, matrix, and cells, remove the cells, a process of decellularization, leaving behind the natural biological architecture of the tissue, and then repopulating it with new stem cells that can be driven for specific purposes. So in this example, you can see that the white fluffy tissue there, that's a placenta after all the cells have been removed. So for those of you who've seen a placenta at the birth of a child or whatnot, you know that it's a pretty beefy, red, meaty organ. When you remove all the cells, it's sort of a translucent, very, very beautiful, frilly sort of structure. You can repopulate that, and you see in the middle photographs, the process of repopulation over time occurs first by the cells traveling in through the vascular tree, then migrating out into the parenchyma, and then taking up residence and differentiating and maturing into the specialized types we're interested in. So some of the work that's ongoing now that we find exciting is we can take a placenta, an old placenta, we can populate it with liver cells. We can populate it with other types of cells that might be useful. And this is a process of what's called creating organoids, and that is something which I think is tremendously promising in our field, and I think that we're on the threshold of seeing these things being applied not only for research purposes, but for support systems for treating, for example, liver failure, et cetera. And then the other two photographs are illustrating some of the other applications where the cells can be utilized in other biocompatible bioreactor environments to produce useful products. In one case, we can populate a synthetic matrix with these cells, and that synthetic matrix can be applied in a surgical environment to fix something. Or in the bottom photograph, we can actually replicate the environment of the bone marrow and use these cells to produce blood and blood-forming elements. So the thing that I wanted to tell you where I'm hoping this all continues to go was triggered by a discussion with Jay when he said, I want you to surprise me, show me something that you think is really exciting and we're going to go to in the future. And this actually ties a little bit to some of the presentations that have occurred so far today. So I'm a big believer that biology ultimately can be integrated with other systems, such as microelectronics and so on. And it turns out that what we're learning about stem cells is that they are highly inducible. When you trigger a stem cell to mature and differentiate, depending upon the physical environment that you place it in, and these are lessons that we learned in some of those tissue engineering exercises I just illustrated for you. When you trigger it to do that, based upon those conditions, you can specify how that cell lays out its cytoskeleton, okay, the structural interior of the cell. You can induce it to lay down things like ion channels. And I'll tell you why this, to me, is exciting. We looked at some of the bionic opportunities of the future. A guy by the name of Peter Fromhertz at the Max Planck for the last 25 years has worked diligently to try and combine neural cells with microelectronics. And the way he's done this is to grow neurons on top of biologically compatible organic semiconductor materials. The problem he has had is he has never been able to improve the resolution below the size of one of these neurons. It's because the neuron is an electrochemical system in its own right, but unless you specifically place the ion channels in the right position, you're not going to get the results you want. In contrast, if you take a neuron and place it on, for example, a field effect transistor, that transistor can actually guide and specifically influence the way that cell lays out its ion channels. And so the hope here is that what we've learned in turning cells into medicine will ultimately allow us to create tools that allow us to integrate systems and create the true neuronal microelectronic interface. So I want to thank you for your time and thank all the females out there who helped produce this remarkable work on the placenta.